Good morning and welcome to this lecture in a series on optimizing home safety. Today we're going to talk about assessing the patient ecosystem. Okay, my name is Dr. Russ L'HommeDieu. It's pronounced L'HommeDieu. Of course, it's French, so it's kind of made to be impossible to pronounce, so you can just go with good old Dr. L. So the learning objectives for this lecture series is to articulate the purpose and the components of a home safety assessment, to grasp the primary objectives and desired outcomes of a home safety assessment, and to identify and quantify risks associated with falls in the home environment. I also want you to develop a systematic approach to evaluating a home and improving the safety in the home. And I want you to explore solutions from simple to even more complex and technological to address home safety concerns. So what is a home safety assessment? It's a 360-degree assessment of a patient's whole living environment by taking into account impediments and impairments. So you should be asking yourself, what are impediments and impairments? Well, impairments we kind of know, right? As physical therapists and occupational therapists, we know that an impairment is an absence or a significant difference in a person's ability to function, either physically or mentally. I think the thing to remember here is that impairments come from within. Now, impediments, on the other hand, is something within the environment that obstructs or hinders. And this term is usually has to do with built environments, like a set of stairs or a door that's not wide enough, right? But it also involves legal barriers, educational barriers, social barriers. It has to do with things that are keeping people from operating at their optimal level that come from outside themselves. So the goal of a home safety assessment is to minimize risk, particularly fall risk, and promote independence and quality of life, as well as safety. So let's go over some fall stats. Why are we so concerned about falls? Well, according to the CDC and other fall research, 1 out of every 4 Americans over the age of 65 fall each year. And they don't just fall, they hurt themselves or they die. In 2021, 38,742 older adults aged 65 and older died from preventable falls. And nearly 2.9 million were treated in emergency departments. So if fall prevention is the only thing that we can accomplish with a home safety assessment, and I'm not saying it's the only thing, but if it were, we would still be making a significant improvement in people's lives. In 2020, an analysis revealed that the majority of falls occurred in the home, with bedrooms, bathrooms, and stairs being the most common locations. So there are 3 elements to a home safety assessment. 1 is risk assessment, right? We need to understand the risks before we can do anything about them. And 2 is risk mitigation. What are we going to do about the things that we find? And 3, and this is a really important aspect, it's a feedback adjustment loop. In systems theory, whenever you make changes to a system, you constantly have to monitor it to see if your changes are having the desired effect, because other aspects of the system can change and your desired effects can change. So it's important to install some kind of feedback or adjustment loops. So let's talk about the risk assessment. Well, first we're going to talk about impairments and then impediments, and then probably the most important factor in any home safety plan is what is the human support? So let's talk about impairments. Now, this is not a lecture to go into take a deep dive on impairments. We do that in other courses, but I do want you to understand a few concepts. Right? Number 1, think of a physical impairment on a scale, right? You have 0 impairments, which means you're out running triathlons and you're able to, certainly in the context of your home, operate without any modifications or any risk. And then we have severe dependents, maybe somebody's bedbound, right? And their needs are going to be different than somebody who is moderately impaired. In fact, I would argue that it's the moderate impairment that offers the most amount of risk, right? If somebody's bedbound and they're not able to get in and out of their bed and they're kind of confined to that room, our home safety assessment is somewhat limited, right? The circle that we're concerned with is confined. Whereas with somebody who is moderate impairment, they're out and about, going up and down stairs, getting in and out of cars, going in and out of restaurants. So the amount of geographical space that we're concerned with as safety experts increases quite a bit. Now, cognitive impairments also sort of have a continuum, right? You're either not impaired at all or you're severely impaired. And this is an interesting juxtaposition because if someone is maybe not that physically impaired, but they're severely mentally impaired, cognitively impaired, and they're able to, let's say, elope and wander around the neighborhood. Now, that's a huge safety risk that we need to deal with, and it's increased because their abilities are pretty good, right? So they can get themselves into quite a bit of mischief. There's another interesting thing about cognitive impairments is that we used to call it non-compliance, right? And I never really cared for that word because it suggested that there was some kind of power gradient, right? I think of it more as a non-adherence. Our recommendations and the patient, they're not adhering. And I think it's important to understand that there's an underlying cognitive process to that. Now, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with that patient. It just means that if they're not adhering to your recommendations, there's a reason why. And I think a lot of times we get caught up in making recommendations and we don't necessarily get too deep into the weeds on the why is somebody not adhering to our recommendations. And I think that's an important thing to address as well. So let's talk about impediments. So there's architectural impediments, and there's impediments in the community, and there's technological impediments, and then there's impediments of social relationships. And they all come into play in this home safety ecosystem. So let's talk about architectural impediments. What we're really talking about here are built environments. So when we think about built environments or architectural impediments, I think the first thing to do is to divide the house or the range of the patient into two separate categories. One is an active zone, and the other is an inactive zone. Now, I don't really need to explain this to you, right? An active zone are places that they are generally likely to go, right? So as I mentioned earlier, someone who is mildly impaired, their active zone might include the grocery store and the Starbucks, right? Where somebody who's a little bit more impaired, maybe we're a little bit more worried about the confines of their home, right? They don't really leave. So when we look at active zones, I'm looking at essential spaces and essential passageways. I'll give you an example, right? So what we're going to do is we're actually going to track the patient's normal activity during the day, sort of in our mind. We're going to imagine their flow, right? So they go from the bedroom, and then, of course, they go to the bathroom, and then from the bathroom, maybe they go to the living area, okay? And now, if this is their normal flow during the day, we have essential spaces would be the bedroom, the bathroom, and the living area, right, the seating area. And then the essential passageways would be the door between the bedroom and the hallway, the door between the hallway and the bathroom, and then, of course, the hallway itself. So as we look at these essential spaces, we start to develop a map of where, hello, I have a visitor. We start to develop a map of what spaces are most important to our patient. And when we start to look at passageways, we start to look at what areas of transition become important to our patient. And of course, we can't forget the primary entrance and egress and the secondary entrance and egress. It's important that patients be able to enter and exit the home by more than one manner. And that's just a safety concern. Like if the house is on fire and it's blocking the primary ingress, egress, we need to have a way for them to get out as well. So here are some questions. What determines an essential and a non-essential space? So take a moment to think about that. So I'm hoping that in your head, you're imagining maybe how you go through your day, right? An essential space are spaces that you need to use or or want to use to improve your quality of life. Okay, so now is a basement or a garage an essential space? Well, the answer is maybe, right? I had a patient with the Veterans Administration who wanted a stair glide to go down to the basement. And as a rule, the VA does not allow us to issue stair glides to go into a basement unless it's deemed an essential space. And we have to do all this documentation as to why it's an essential space. A lot of times, maybe there's a laundry down there that can't be relocated. In this case, it was the Veterans Art Studio, right? And the VA at the time really wasn't recognizing the art studio as an essential space. So I want to say for 2 years, the veteran was advocating for this stair glide to go to his art studio. The VA was denying it. We finally were able to make a case and get the stair glide for his art studio. It turned out he was a famous artist. And he went down there, he curated some of his work, he created some new work. He had an auction, and I kid you not, he raised $250,000 for his own care simply by going through some of his old artwork that apparently the art world was just craving. And we had no idea. So in this case, yes, the basement was an essential space to this person for their quality and apparently their financial life. So now what happens when an essential space is absolutely inaccessible? And think about that for a second. Like we absolutely can't get the patient to their essential space. Let's say, for instance, he couldn't transfer to a stair glide. Let's say that patient who needed to get to his basement couldn't transfer to a stair glide. What do we do? So sometimes we have absolute inaccessibility, right? Maybe he had a ladder to get down to his basement and we couldn't put a stair glide there. That's the time that we need to get creative and start to look at adaptation strategies or adaptation strategies. What are we going to do to help that person live in their space with a maximum of quality of life? Maybe we move the laundry room to the upstairs. A lot of times it's a second floor bedroom that we have a problem with. So person's living space is on the second floor, but their kitchen and everything else is on the first floor. And at that point, maybe what we have to do is repurpose a room. And a lot of times we'll take a dining room that's not being used. We'll put up curtains over passageways and we'll put a hospital bed in the dining room in the hopes that maybe they can get to a point where they can get back to their bedroom on the second floor. In the absence of a bathroom, a lot of times we have to put a commode in the room. It's not always the most ideal situation, but these are adaptations that we can make. The other thing to understand about built spaces is that we do want to at least acknowledge and prepare for catastrophic emergencies, fire, carbon monoxide poisoning. So we want to have some of the basics: fire extinguishers, CO alarms, smoke alarms, updated emergency contact list, updated medication list. Maybe we can get the patient a PERS device, which is a personal emergency response system. It's the button that you push in case you fall. And we want to make sure that they have some reliable telecommunications. Well, let's talk about community impediments. So what is their community like? Is it travelable? Is it even in their essential space, right? Is it something that they can actually navigate, right? Is there transportation? Do they drive? Is the community itself safe? Is it accessible, right? So it could be safe and there could be transportation, but maybe there's no sidewalks, right? Maybe it's a rural area and there's really no way to get from where the patient is to where they need to be. So it's important to understand that the entire community that surrounds a patient is going to determine basically how well they're going to be able to operate in their home environment. Let's talk about technical impediments. Now with technical impediments, that's actually kind of new, right? We weren't talking about technical impediments to home safety 5 years ago, right? We didn't really care if they had internet connectivity. But now with all the advancing technologies in remote patient monitoring and remote therapeutic monitoring, we're really concerned about how connected they are. So let's talk about technological impediments. First of all, there's internet connectivity, right? They have to be connected to the internet. 2, there's a knowledge gap. And 3, there's something that we call predilection. So what is predilection? Predilection is, how do people feel about technology? How do they relate to technology, right? We have people who grew up with technology since the beginning of their time, right? They're digital natives. They've never lived in a world without the internet. They've never lived in the world without a smartphone. They take to it like most people take to anything else that's native to their environment. And then you have people like me that certainly didn't have the internet when I was growing up. I had a dial phone when I was growing up. We had a black and white television, right? I'm what's called a digital adaptive, right? As the technology evolved, I kind of evolved with it, and I actually got kind of good at it, right? And then you have people like in my mom's generation who are digitally averse. She refused to get a smartphone. She refused to learn how to text. She does not want any part of it. And for those people, they need a little bit more care in introducing some of these technological advancements into their home. And as far as the knowledge gap, well, these people are going to have the greatest knowledge gap, right? So there's going to be a lot of patient education to try to explain why some of these technologies might actually help them be safer at home and have a better quality of life. So let's talk about social relationships, right? They can be impediments as well. The first big impediment is social isolation. There's a lot of research to suggest that one of the major indicators of happiness and longevity is actually connectedness, being able to have people that you can connect with, can talk with, can relate to on a deeply emotional level. And in the absence of that, it creates a whole series of health risks that transcend just being alone. And the other side of that spectrum is, well, what if they're not isolated? What if they're surrounded with toxic people? I'll never forget, once I had a veteran and his grandson moved in and immediately started a drug trafficking operation out of the house. And it obviously caused all the problems that you might expect with active drug dealing going on in this 95-year-old veteran's home. So toxic people are something that you need to be aware of as well. So as we continue through the risk assessment, this is probably a good time to talk about human support. So, and this is a really important point. The human support can be the single most important variable in any age-in-place strategy. Age-in-place is a term that we use to allow people to stay in their homes as long as possible with the maximum amount of safety and quality of life. So human support is basically determined by three things: willingness, ability, and proximity. Now, you could have a family member that's willing, right? But they're not competent. They're not either. How about this? You have a 95-year-old woman and it's a 75-year-old child. And the 75-year-old child is in need of even more help than the 95-year-old patient. So they may be willing, but they're not able. And maybe they're willing and they're able, but they live 5 states away, right? So there are different strategies that we would employ for someone who is, let's say, a remote caregiver. So we would definitely talk about how to incorporate remote caregiving strategies if we know that our human support is willing, able, but doesn't have the proximity necessary to be able to do what we want to do. So as you can imagine, it doesn't take a great amount of imagination to think that the human factor is going to equalize a lot of other barriers, right? The human factor is going to give someone an increased range in the community, let's say, if they can transfer to a vehicle and be driven somewhere. So never, ever underestimate the value of the human support in your home safety assessment. Now we get to the fun stuff, right? The mitigation, the interventions. We found some problems. Let's talk about what we're going to do about it. Maybe the best way to do that is with a case study. So John is a 68-year-old retired teacher and recent transtibial amputee due to diabetes. He faces significant challenges in his single-story home. The home safety assessment highlights critical issues. There's 5 steps that obstruct wheelchair access to his primary ingress and egress. There's narrow doorways that limit mobility, and his bathroom lacks necessary grab bars, and there's a glass shower doors. Okay, so I want you to just take a second and think about how you might address some of these impediments along with his impairments. So let's talk first about the 5 steps. The first thing you're probably thinking is, well, maybe I'll get a ramp, right? So my question is, how long does the ramp need to be? And I think this would be a great time for us to do our ramp lab. So I have a little demo set up, and we're going to talk about the length of a ramp, and I think the results are going to surprise you. So most people, when they say they want a ramp, this is what they want, okay? And our case study is going to want this ramp for his 5 steps. And the problem is that it's way too short, okay? So how long does a ramp need to be? The American Disabilities Act requires a run and rise of 12 to 1. That's for every 1 inch of rise, 1 foot of length in a ramp. That's an 8.3% slope. So if 5 steps are approximately 8 inches each, that's a 40-foot ramp. So 40 feet times 12 is 480 inches, right? So that's a long ramp. And the other thing is that ramps that exceed 30 feet require a landing. Why do you think they require a landing? Because rolling up a 40-foot ramp is really tiring, and you need a place to be able to rest. So that ramp that they thought they wanted really needs to look more like this. And if you've got your heart set on this simple little ramp because you really don't want a ramp at all, and this is what you're going to need, you're going to need to do a little convincing, right? Because they are not going to be happy having this monstrosity, as they often will call it, in front of their homes. Let's talk about narrow doorways that limit mobility, okay? So the first thing you need to understand is that a doorway has essentially 2 openings. There's the available opening and the functional opening. So if you look here, this is the functional opening. It goes from molding to molding, and it's about 24 inches, okay? Just 24 inches almost exactly. Well, the problem is that the functional opening goes from the molding on the door to the actual door. Now, that's about 22 inches. So the door and the molding itself have taken away 2 inches of functional opening from your doorway. Now, there's a couple of ways to fix this, right? One way is you could actually remove the door and put up a curtain. And in a lot of bathrooms will do that, especially if the patient's living alone and they can manage the curtain safely. That gives us the full available opening of the door. And sometimes that 2 inches is all they need to get a walker in safely or to get a wheelchair in safely. But the other thing we can do is you can actually get what are called offset hinges. And it's actually it's not an optical illusion, right? The door closes normally, but when it opens, the reveal of the door gets pocketed behind the doorway molding. So now it increases the functional opening to almost, it increases the available opening almost to the functional opening. Now, if we wanted to, we could actually take off the molding here, and that would give us roughly, with this molding, roughly ½ an inch if we took it off on both sides. Now, obviously, you really need the full cooperation and permission of your patients before you start making these modifications, but sometimes it's all they need, right? So now the bathroom lacks necessary grab bars, and we have glass shower doors. The first thing I always do is I ask patients to remove the glass shower doors. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, you fall into the shower doors fall over, you fall into a pile of glass. It's a mess. Not a great situation. So they offer a safety hazard just by being there. People are constantly trying to grab on the the doors thinking that they're grab handles and pulling the handles off the glass doors or pulling the glass doors right off the tracks. So the other problem is that it offers a limited amount of space for people to get in there and help you. So we have them take the doors off, we put a curtain up. And for this particular case, I would probably use what's called a tub transfer seat. And this is a device where the patient can sit outside the tub. In this case, the toilet is arranged in such a way that they could actually transfer onto the toilet, use the toilet, and slide over and use the tub. You can put a grab bar across this wall, sure, absolutely, and that would help a little bit, especially if they had the stability to maybe stand once they were in the tub, and the bar could help them to maintain the stability while they stood. And of course, a handheld shower on a hose is a must here, and you would find a place to mount the handheld shower so that they could get it from here. You want them to be able to have access to the shower temperature controls so that they can adjust the temperature on their own, unless there's a cognitive impairment that would make that unsafe. The other thing that you would want to do is make sure that if you did have grab bars put in, that they were adequately anchored. And that's a lecture for another day. We can talk about the specific requirements of how to anchor grab bars. So this is a particularly good strategy, and it represents a viable intervention for this patient. So I want to briefly discuss technological interventions. I mean, we're fortunate to live in a world where if we can imagine it, we can do it. But just because we can doesn't mean we should. We should ask, can we do it simpler? Can we do it cheaper? Can we do a solution that's more reliable? And are we doing something that patients and caregivers can actually implement? So one of the things I did is when I was at the VA, I started a home safety technology program. And I was super excited. The VA was going to fund it. We're going to do all sorts of great things. And I started out with something simple, automated lighting. And what I learned pretty quickly is that I got very complicated very quickly. I started using all these advanced sensors that would go to the internet and then communicate back to the lights, and the lights would turn off, and then there would be a problem with the internet, and then nobody could turn on their lights. So I found that sometimes the simplest interventions are the best. So it's the goal of all technological interventions to address a problem or set of problems arising from the home safety assessment in the simplest, most cost-effective way possible. Now, I also use the word transparent there, and what I mean by that is transparent is it's seamless to the user. So for instance, the simpler technology for automated lighting is I put in 12-volt LED light strips with battery backups, and then just a localized motion sensor. And I put them all in baseboards and under beds. So as people walk by, the floor lit up so that they could see adequately. So a very, very simple solution, very reliable, battery backups, so that even when the power went out, people had lighting on their floor. And it was transparent to them because they didn't have to do anything. Another thing I'm working on now is touchless fall detection. So these are radar arrays that scan the room and can tell if somebody falls. And I think that these technologies are really valuable because with a personal emergency response system, there are sort of 4 friction points. First, you have to get the patient to agree to have the device. Then you have to get the patient to agree to keep the device charged. And then you have to have the patient agree to wear it. And then this is going to seem counterintuitive. They actually have to push it when they fall. And I can't tell you how many patients we've had who had these devices, agreed to wear them, agreed to keep them charged, and then just didn't press them when they fell. Because the first symptom of a fall is denial. They don't want to actually acknowledge they fell. And so that becomes a problem. So it's not good to use technology for the sake of just using technology. It's important to imagine the user experience. What are you trying to accomplish with the technology, and what is the user experience with the technology? And if the answer is that the user is getting the benefit from the technology, but they don't have to think about it, sometimes that's the best technology to use. And finally, we're going to talk about feedback and adjustment loops. So it's basically follow-up, right? And there are three basic categories of follow-up. One is enhanced communication. You want enhanced communication with caregivers, with clinicians, with patients. And that could be through telephone, through video communications, through text, through email, whatever increases that flow of information and whatever allows you to ask the important and relevant questions. And of course, there's always revisits, right? At the VA, I was, very honored to be part of a program where I could visit veterans as much as I needed to. Just get in the car and go, and check in on them, make sure they were okay, and make sure my strategies were working. And then now, increasingly, technology plays a role. And of course, technology is part of enhanced communication, but it's sort of enhanced communication in a different way. Yes, we have video communication, and that's great. So we can get a good eye on the patient. But we also have remote therapeutic monitoring peripheries and remote physiological monitoring peripheries. And the cool thing about this is, imagine that you had a device that could tell you how many times somebody got out of bed, right? It's a bed mat, but it transfers the data to a central database. And there's a computer, call it an AI, call it whatever you want, that's actually tracking the patterns over time. And let's say you had a patient that was getting up and going to the bathroom more often, right? And that your data suggests that when somebody reaches a certain threshold of having, maybe gone to the bathroom once a night, once they reach the threshold, maybe 3 or 4, whatever the data says, that maybe they're at higher risk for a UTI. And we know that urinary tract infections often lead to conditions that lead to falls, right? So imagine we could screen people for urinary tract infections based on their behavior, based on what the remote physiological monitoring is telling us, and then treat those infections before they result in a fall. And that's a very, very simple example of predictive analytics and where I think healthcare may be going with all of these remote physiological and remote therapeutic monitoring peripheries. So that is the conclusion of this discussion. There are other lectures in this series, and I look forward to being able to present them to you.